Joining me on stage, we have two men, Thomas Dolby, who you probably have heard of, or you wouldn't be here, and Peter Vogel, who without him you may not have heard the same sounds out of Thomas Dolby. We're going to ask some questions about the past and some things about the present and possibly the future. We'll start, as you would, you'd think we're going to start in the past, and this thing here looks like a thing from the past, and we'll be referencing it throughout the evening. It's a Fairlight, and you may have heard of a Fairlight. Maybe if I start with you, Peter, I want to ask you about the early part of your inventive life. Peter got a patent, his first patent, when he was 16, and it was something to do with phones.
Oh, there are a number of things. Yes, one of them was a device for locking telephones in the days before there were exchanges where you could lock out long-distance calls. Sort of my first sort of creative invention was a thing called the television image modulator, and what it did was when you played music, it created these abstract patterns that moved around on the TV, which we all know now today from every computer has this thing called a visualizer that makes patterns while you're playing music. And I spent a lot of my parents' money on patenting that when I was about 14 years old, so that was sort of in the early 70s. And the big problem with that invention was that we didn't have colour television yet in Australia. So you could only see it in black and white. And by the time, of course, PCs started coming out with that visualizer facility, the patent was already about 20 years lapsed. So it was one of a series of very good ideas that were commercial disasters.
We'll probably talk about that throughout the course of this evening. The timing. Timing is a huge thing for when you do something. And invention and timing, how do you know when is the right time to realise an invention?
Don't pretend you know the answer.
I don't. Yes. I can tell, I can advise others, and that is just not when I do it. Then they can't go wrong.
Thomas, your early career, would you have called it a career when you were playing in Paris? Was that getting paid money and living well?
I was not living well. In fact, I had to show up in the metro station at Odeon with an empty guitar case in front of me. And as I played, I would keep an eye on how much money was in there, because once there was enough for lunch, that's when I stopped work for the day and spent the afternoon in a bar with the other buskers in the Latin Quarter. But I do remember one time I sort of took a shortcut to that because I was playing, I think it was probably Stairway to Heaven, you know, and a little old lady with her shopping bag stopped in front of me. She was listening and tapping her feet, and she said to me, my French is not very good, but she said, Jeune homme, j'aime bien votre chanson, mais j'ai pas d'argent, mais voici un chou-fleur. And she pulled out a cauliflower from her bag and threw it in my guitar case and walked off. And I thought, well, if I'm really stuck, I could just eat that, you know. So it was not, I wouldn't call it living well at all, no. But it was the beginning of a career, because it's actually a very good initiation into what makes music popular. If the amount of time you have to get the hook in somebody's head is the time it takes for them to walk from that corner down to where you are.
Then from that early beginnings, and you've got an idea of what an audience wants and what will work, and then there's the punk explosion and the idea that anyone can do it, and that's starting to form in your mind, I imagine, and that the technology is on the horizon, that you can be a one-person band. What's the path between the guitar in Paris and being a one-person band?
Well, I mean, you mentioned punk being sort of, a message to everybody that anybody can be a star. But conversely, in the world of electronic music, it was sort of the opposite, because the electronics of the mid-70s were only really accessible to very rich pop stars or recording studios or university music departments. They were not for every man at all. And in fact, while punk was going on in London, there was a sort of converse movement, an underground electronic music movement And there were some of us, bands like Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire and so on. And London University Music Department had an electronics section, and there was a skip out the back, and we used to regularly go through the skip to look for little circuit boards and things that we could sort of solder together and add on to our kits. The first synthesizer I actually had, I bought out of the back of Popular Mechanics magazine, and it was called a Transcendent 2000. And it was a horrible little thing. It didn't have a keyboard. It was sort of distant cousin of the VCS-3, which is what Pink Floyd had used on Dark Side of the Moon. And that was the first thing I got to experiment with, much to the annoyance of my neighbours.
So we've got two careers here. This is quite an interesting thing that I didn't find out till just a moment ago, that the instrument that we've been referring to a little bit, and we'll get to, is the common path of the start of the careers, and it's come back, and we'll talk about why it's come back again in a little while. But you two hadn't spoken before you've come out to Australia.
Yeah, we met yesterday for the first time.
But it was his tool that helped give your music career a direction.
Yeah.
Is that weird?
Is it weird?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't meet Bob Moog until quite late in his life either. And there's, certainly I've never met Mr. Steinway. It's not all that bizarre to have not met the maker of your tool.
And if Peter comes to it from being an inventor who has found music, and you come from it being a musician who has found invention and technology. So Peter, first of all, was music something that interested you, or was it just an outlet for invention?
It was something that interested me. I came from a musical family, and I'd always been interested in music in general, and I'd attempted to learn various instruments during my school years. I started learning violin, and I played a little bit of that for a while until it got too hard. Then I started learning piano, and that was too much like hard work as well, and took up saxophone for a while. And I was sort of interested in the abstract, but I wasn't willing to put the work in. And so really my interest in electronic music was born out of laziness, in that I saw, hang on, maybe I can get a machine that will let me make music without actually having to learn to play an instrument. As it turned out, it would have been a lot easier to learn to play an instrument. That's another story.
And Thomas, for you, what was the path towards technology? So you're in the skip, pulling bits out. How did you learn what they would do and how to put them together?
Yeah, I have no background in electronics or engineering or anything like that, so I was always a dabbler. I would just try things out, basically. I played piano rather badly, and I suppose it was really two things. The first was that in my imagination, I heard all sorts of different sounds and textures and tones, and I liked the idea of sort of painting sounds with a variety of different types of instrument. But obviously, having no formal training, I was never going to get to write for orchestra or anything like that. So one of the appeals of getting into synthesis for me was, well, here's a clarinet, here's a string section, here's a set of timpanis. And to get expressive as a composer with a variety of different instruments, that was really the appeal of it for me. But having said that, when I started, synthesizers were monophonic. You could play one note at a time. Tape recorders had 2 tracks. If you wanted to build something up, you had to ping pong back and forth from track A to track B, and you had to make decisions as you went along. And so it was very, very limiting. But out of those limitations came, great ingenuity. I think if you're limited like that, you're forced to use your imagination and find ways around it.
Well, let's start to talk about the CMI, the Fairlight, that was around in 82. Was that the year, Peter, that this one had its birth?
No, it actually, the first one was sold in 1979. We started on the project in 74 and then built a prototype which I took on tour around the world showing it to various potential customers, and then the first commercial production started in 79.
And what was it about the tool? How did you come across it?
Well, there was a TV show in England called Tomorrow's World, and it was on every Thursday night before Top of the Pops. And Top of the Pops was the pop show in the UK, and anybody that was remotely interested in music was watching at that time. So you invariably caught the end of Tomorrow's World right before it. And I remember I was watching one night, and there was a computer on there, but had a keyboard, and I thought, well, that was kind of interesting, and that got me interested. And then the next thing I know, the guy's drawing waveforms on the screen of the computer. And I thought, well, that's very sexy, you know, and because, I mean, keyboard players are not conventionally very sexy, you know. We were always jealous of the guitar player. But the idea of being up there on stage, sort of drawing my own waveforms, that sounded pretty chic. You know.
And then the step from watching the television show to coming across the instrument?
Well, yeah. There were early adopters in the UK who got a hold of a Fairlight by hook or by crook. And they were mostly people like Peter Gabriel or Kate Bush, or there's a band called Landscape, who were some of the first exponents. And it was clear that you could do something new with this instrument, which hadn't been possible before, which you can take any sound at all that you can think of and turn it into, you know, a musical instrument. And that was really a new concept. There'd been mellotrons before, you know, like the ones used on Sgt. Pepper's and Strawberry Fields and things like that. But they had flute and violin and a couple of preset sounds. They didn't have sheet bars and breaking bottles and things like that. So it was tremendously exciting, the possibilities.
You've written things like people may or may not know Lena Lovich's new toy, and Houdini. That was a fantastic piece of hip-hop. Does the invention of technology instantly help with composition, or is composition something that can be confused by technology?
Well, the latter is certainly true. But the former is also true, because sometimes when you play with a new instrument, you hit on a sound that is so inspiring that it you know, next thing you know, you've written a song. A case in point was a bass sound that I came across on a PPG, which is a German synthesizer. It was one of the first wavetable synthesizers. And the wavetable was so extreme that as you played a note, it had a rhythm within the note. And before I knew it, I'd started a groove, and it was a song of mine called Wind Power, and it really came about because of the sort of, you know, the oddness of that basic sound is what led to a whole song. So it definitely does happen.
So there's no longer a simple thing of sitting there with the guitar or a piano going, where will I go? You've got this more and more variance on discovery of the compositional thrust. How do you start to compose if there's so many options?
You can come at it from any way at all.
How do you come at it now?
Well, it might be a line of lyrics. It might be a melody I start whistling in the shower. It might be patch number 137, you know, on a new instrument that I find, where I just sit there and I go, ooh, and the next thing I know, I've started writing something. Or it might be an idea that, well, I want to write an album called A Map of the Floating City. I don't know why. I don't know why I want to make that album, but I just have this vision in my head, and I start exploring and fleshing out, you know, the different nooks and crannies of that concept. And you make 1,000 little decisions, you know. You reject, you play a lot of stuff, and you try things that you reject, and then you hit on one that just feels right.
Is there this will be a yes and no answer as well, I'm sure. Working mostly by yourself in composition and playing gives you're the boss, you can make every decision, but also then you're isolated from others' input at that level. There's pros and cons. Do you intellectualize those so that you can be aware of them, or do you just make music?
Well, you know, I mean, I've always collaborated a lot with other people. I've played keyboards on other people's albums and co-written and produced other bands and so on. And it's a very different proposition if you're collaborating, because you're part of a team and you hope that 2 and 2 makes 5, you know, that it adds up to something greater than the sum of the parts. And you have to have respect for the other people's feelings, and you have to try and jam with them. I don't mean real-time, you know, jamming, but I mean in terms of the concept, knocking the concept back and forth and building it up and so on. So, you know, when I was playing keyboards with Foreigner or a Def Leppard or whatever, those are completely different genres of music from my own. But it forced me to reevaluate the formulae that I use in my own music, because Foreigner, for example, was an American AOR act, with the sort of hard rock songs that they had, and they got me in the studio and they said, well, we want to do a ballad, and we've never really done a ballad before. And they had a nice chord sequence and nice melody to it and some drums and everything, but they said, we want something really special that will announce it, when it comes on the radio, just go, ah. And I said, well, have you ever heard of Brian Eno? And they sort of looked blankly at each other. And one of them said, you mean that massage music? And I said, well, no, it doesn't have to be like that. It could actually be rather wonderful to start a rock ballad with some ambient sort of Eno-esque music. So they left me all night in the studio and came back in this is Electric Lady Studios in New York. They left me about 10 o'clock at night, and they came back in at 9 o'clock in the morning. And they'd given me 6 tracks, and I sort of built up this piece of ambient music, and that became the intro to Waiting for a Girl Like You, which is a huge radio hit and big #1 platinum seller in the States. And so you'd be in middle America, in Memphis, Tennessee or something, and this Eno music would come on for 15 seconds, and it was a kind of rather a subversive act, I think.
Subversion there's elements that you're quite a subversive fellow when it comes to music. You've not gone to aim to generate the hit factory. Yes, you've got hits, but they're tempered by a whole lot of other music that I don't think you would have made thinking this is going to be my big hit. It's going to be a great album, but the song itself will be subtle or complex or odd. What's the thought process about your creation of music? What are you trying to achieve? And do you go, I'll put in a pop thing to help the album, or is the process?
Yeah. I'm a contrarian, really. It's like I listen to stuff that's in the charts or on the radio, and that's what I don't want to do. I don't write relationship songs. I try and use other elements to inspire songs. I've always been very inspired by the environment that I'm in. So there's a lot of geography, a lot of place names. My new album, for example, has got 3 different continents on it, and they reflect different periods of my life living in different places, but also the displacement when you move from one place to another. All of that is really reflected in the songs. I talk about technology, and I talk about sort of fear of technology. A song like Flying North, is about fear of flying. And or New Toy, which is about that sort of obsession that you get with new gadgets and gimmicks and so on. And I always try and find a different way into a song. And I like odd, different, eccentric. I like that stuff. I don't like manicured, generic music. And I would take no pleasure or pride in just scoring a commercial success with something that just went with the flow. When I was growing up, my heroes were always oddballs, and I have no idea where their records got to in the charts. It didn't matter to me. In fact, I would have felt rather betrayed if, a Frank Zappa song or a Captain Beefheart song was at #1 in the charts, because that somehow took it away from the personal, and made it a piece of public property. But those kind of artists were very personal to me.
Your career is... We'll talk about the more recent years in the second part, but your career has not been linear. It has been, even in any particular phase of it, you've managed to branch out and work with other people, work with yourself, do albums, and be in control, but it's hard to predict where it's going. Was there a plan?
No, it's never a plan. No, it's always a lot of, a lot of random in there, a lot of chaos. Because the moment I feel myself settling into a groove, I want to sort of break it and go mess around with something where I'm floundering, where I don't know what I'm doing. And I think Peter's the same, really. I think we've compared notes about this, and we both have blinkers, have tunnel vision. We ignore what's really going on in the world, and even the reaction to the stuff that we create is not important to us because we're both on to the next thing, right?
Is that true of you, Peter?
Well, it certainly was in terms of Fairlight. I was in an interesting position in that my customers were, by definition, rich pop stars, because we were selling an instrument that was $100,000 plus.
Yeah, I
And this
wasn't rich after I bought my Fairlight.
Right. I did have. I'll just digress for a moment in that in all my years of dealing with musicians and so on, I must say that every one of them I've met have been delightful people, except for one particular person whose name I won't mention.
Yes, you will.
No.
Come on.
And he.
We've got it down to
This
gender, it's
particular
a he.
Yes, this particular person borrowed a Fairlight for a week and said, I want to check it out and see if I like it. And then when I went to pick it up again, he said, yeah, it's pretty cool, I'll keep it. I said, terrific, how do you want to pay for it? And he said, oh, I'm not going to pay for it. I never pay for anything. And I said, well, I'm sorry, we can't afford to do that. And he said, but, I'm a really famous pop star, And I said, well, sorry to tell you this, but all our customers are famous pop stars, if not when they buy the Fairlight, shortly afterwards. And I took it away, and that was the end of that.
And he didn't return as a customer?
No. In fact, I got feedback from other people that he'd been bad-mouthing the instrument as a result. However, what was the question that I didn't answer? I digress.
It had to do with the plan. Is there a plan?
Oh, I see. Yes, that's right. Well, because I was such a nerd my whole life, I was completely sort of cut off from what was really going on in the world, and I didn't know any of my customers from a bar of soap, which helped, I think, in a way, in that I didn't sort of get starstruck about it. And when someone said, "Oh, look, can you deliver this Fairlight to Stevie Wonder?" it was just like I thought, well, that's a bit of a wanky name, and that was about the end of it. And I really had no idea then, and I really don't much more today, about how the instruments were being used and what records were coming out. And people
So you don't know the names of the tracks that were made famous by your machine?
No.
It would be interesting to know.
Well, I'm having someone will write a book about it one day, and I can find out. But other people tell me, but the names don't mean anything to me, because I never spent any time listening to the radio. I was building them and pulling them apart, and I didn't watch TV, or at least not from the front. And my greatest thrill with a vinyl record was when I found one that had it was one of those records that had like a surprise track at the end, and if you left the record on after a minute, it would play something else, which meant that there was about a minute of silence at the end of the record. And I thought, oh, this has potential. And I wondered, if I was to connect the stylus to the output of the amplifier and the microphone to the amplifier and yell into it while it's playing the silence, could actually record something into that groove. And it didn't work terribly well, and I burnt out the cartridge, but there was definitely, in amongst the noise, if you turned it up really high, you could hear that you'd recorded something. So that was sort of my approach to music, was to sort of see what weird things I could do with it and what the technical limitations were.
So before you talked about Fairlight coming about because you couldn't maintain the enthusiasm to learn an instrument, did you want to play music that much that you would spend that much time whacking away at the technology to churn out the machine that would do it for you?
No, that wasn't the motivator. The motivator was, it seemed to be really difficult, and I was sure that it can't be that hard. I thought, if you can yell into a cone and record on a wax cylinder and play music back, how hard can it be to make something electronic sound like another instrument? So it was really the challenge of it that inspired me, and it was just at the end of my my high school career, and I'd sort of spent my whole life up till then tinkering with all sorts of electronics, not necessarily musical things. And someone, Kim Ryrie, who I went to school with, was had designed an analog synthesizer, sort of more along the Moog style of thing. And I'd been fascinated with computers since I was in primary school. And so going back to sort of the 1960s, I'd been building computers in my bedroom. And so I had quite a good grasp of digital technology before microprocessors and things made it commonplace. And so when school finished, Kim said, "Hey, do you want to join with me and make some sort of a digitally controlled synthesizer?" So our vision at the start was we'd get a synthesizer like a Moog, and we'd connect it to a computer, and the computer could remove all the knobs and patch cords and things, and you'd be able to save things and recall them. And that sounded like a really good idea and eminently doable. So we started down that track, actually developing such an instrument. And we worked on that for a couple of years, and just by accident we heard about another engineer in Sydney by the name of Tony First, who'd been developing an instrument which I think he'd been commissioned by the Canberra School of Music to develop this fully digital synthesizer. And we thought, wow, we can do away with the analogue thing altogether if we go fully digital. And we met with Tony, and we were really excited by what he was doing, and we decided to join forces. And we ended up using the core of what he'd done. We turned that into what became the Fairlight eventually, many years later.
The Fairlight, when it first started, had its limitations. If you compare it to technology now, you'd say you wouldn't use it if you were living now, but we're not. We're living then. Can you describe, Thomas, the limitations, the parameters of what you could do on a Fairlight?
Yeah, I mean, the first Fairlights that became available, you had 8 voices. So in other words, you could play one chord with 8 notes, or you could play 8 different sounds. And each of the sounds was limited to a little bit under a second each, depending on where you played it on the keyboard. But if you took a sample, you could have a flute, for example, you were limited to less than a second of that note. But you could then loop it and therefore sustain it. So that was the main limitation. And then it had a sequencer called Page R, which became very, very famous as one of the first sequencers, that people would compose on. And you still were limited to 8 voices, so you could have 8 tracks in there. You could use, 3 of them for drums and 1 for bass and 4 for a string part or something like that. And those are the limits really. But I mean, I remember the day that I first unboxed my Fairlight and started playing around with it. And one of the fascinating things was how different things sounded in different pitches. For example, there was a sound effects section on there, and one of the sound effects was the sound of an arrow sort of sticking into a post. Thong! And as I slowed that down and sped it up quite a lot, it took on completely different characters. And when I slowed it way, way down, it was almost like a sort of mutated cymbal crash. So I started writing a song there and then called White City, which kicked off with this arrow sound slowed down. You were very limited. I mean, you'd make a decision like that. And you say, right, I'm going to use that arrow sound. But now you've used up one of your 8 voices. So you can forget about having a big piano part or something like that in there as well. So you had to sort of plan out a little bit, plan ahead, and decide how you're going to use those voices. In a sense, is that more inventive than having an unlimited palette that you have now? Well, it's way more inventive, yeah. But having said that, I mean, given there are only half a dozen of us that got our hands on this thing, we are considered great pioneers. But, I mean, anybody would have been a pioneer because it was really a disruptive technology, It was a revolutionary technology, and the impact was great. And even those people that couldn't get their hands on one, they were hearing sounds on records that they knew couldn't be done using conventional instruments. And I think, the big hits that really featured things like that, like Babushka by Kate Bush, which had, breaking bottles all over it, or Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel that had that sort of Indonesian flute thing in it, which is like such a major, it's just one sample, fired off in the middle, and it made a hit record, Or The Art of Noise, who were making entire recordings, like Peter Gunn theme, just using the Fairlight. Even people that couldn't get in front of a Fairlight themselves, they knew there was something going on when sampled sounds like that started making it onto the radio.
So when you unboxed yours and the other 7 people unboxed theirs, was there a rush to use it before someone else used the sound that you knew was in the box?
Well, in a situation like that, I can't remember how many sounds would have been in that first library.
Maybe 200.
Yeah, I mean, lots of them were like clarinet, flute, violins, whatever. So fairly generic sounds, but there are a few quirky ones, like the ones that I mentioned, and you're sort of aware. That, well, if that's something that leaps out, if there's like a dog bark, it's tempting to sort of, make a hit record using a dog barking. But, some other idiot is going to do the same thing, So you sort of steer away from it. But having said that, it was nowhere near as bad in those days as it is today, because statistically, with 10,000 people in the world all using the same little iPhone app, statistically, there's just a high probability somebody will come up with the same exact combination.
And musical taste, it was different in the 80s. There was, I feel, more of a chance for diversity than there is now.
Mm-hmm.
And people exercise that for art's sake as well as food on the plate. And now it seems there are different motivators. Do you hear a difference in the music now to then?
Well, I mean, it's a huge difference, obviously.
I don't mean just tonally, I mean attitudinally, what the point of music is as the maker of, not you, but people who make music don't do it necessarily for the art's sake as much now as it seemed to be then. Then it was new and fresh all the time, and now it doesn't feel as fresh all the time.
No, I think you've got rose-coloured spectacles on.
They
I think there was plenty of crap back then as well, in reality. But I think we probably filter out a lot of that, and we remember, the gems from that period. And so it's very easy to think that things were better back then.
Was the Fairlight a crap generator? Was there bad things made on Fairlight?
No. No, I mean, when it became possible to start using string sections and things like that, obviously in the wrong hands, it wasn't enough to just have a machine that could reproduce a string section. You needed to have the taste to do it well and to combine it with other instruments in a good arrangement and to use it in your production in the studio, to use it in the mix, to create a context around it that made good sense. Obviously taste accounts for a lot. And the more gimmicky aspect of things, did get overused. I mean, the first thing people would do when they got a Fairlight was sort of find a sound like that, and the next thing that they're going to go in there and do something gimmicky and try and stick it out there. And so a lot of that stuff is bound to happen.
When you made the leap into Fairlight and where suddenly you could be a band, a string section and everything, but previously you just had your guitar or your keyboard, were you trained, or how did you get to be an arranger when you only previously could have 1 or 2 instruments at the most going at once?
I learnt it from the Fairlight, to be perfectly honest. I thought, now let's try some oboes. And I learnt what I know about oboes from using the Fairlight and trying them out. And actually it became a bit of an issue, because if an oboe doesn't go down as low as you need it to go, you just change a parameter and now you get an extra octave. And in fact, quite late, relatively late in life, probably in my late 20s, I realized that it was limiting me, that I didn't really understand orchestration. I can barely read and write music. And so I was in LA and I started taking some orchestration lessons from an old master. And I'd learned about instruments from working with them on the Fairlight. And so I had to unlearn a lot of the things that I was doing, because you can't actually play an oboe, in that octave. And if you're writing for clarinets, there's a break in the clarinet, and you have to work around that, because even a great clarinet player is going to sound crappy if you make him play over the break. Or a French horn player, you can play long single notes all day, but if you have them going lots of percussive things, they're going to tire very quickly. and you wear them out. And so I was used to working with a machine that just does as it's told. And when I started working with real people and real instruments, you know, there were a new set of limitations that I had not been aware of.
Obviously, they're a different experience, and you now have the choice of using both. Do you still use both, real musicians and technology? And use the technology instead of real musicians?
You know, actually what I like to do is use real musicians and record everything, and then go home and chop it up and use it as sort of big rubber stamps. You know, I don't really have the patience. If you take a building block approach, note by note, sound by sound, and you build this whole masterpiece, it's very, very laborious, and you know, it takes a long time, and you can get very perfectionist and obsessive about it. Whereas with real musicians, it's a sort of a different thing, because when a group of musicians get in a room, they're constantly making real-time adjustments to each other, to tuning, to mix, to timing, and so you get multiple elements that all know about each other. On a machine, you can program your clarinets and your oboes and your strings, and they have absolutely no knowledge of each other at all. You know, they just each exist in isolation. So you don't get that organic adjustment that's going on. So what I much prefer to do is to work initially with musicians, despite all of the impurities of their playing, despite bum notes or whatever it may be. All of those things can be interesting, and all of those things can be fixed later if I need to fix them. But the organic sort of blend that comes from them working together is a much more inspiring starting place than programming note by note.
So, Peter, does hearing that inspire you to make the machine that will have the different tracks talking to each other?
Yes, in fact, that's a subject that we were talking about just yesterday, and that sort of thing's definitely desirable and possible, and interesting to see how differently that will behave. But just coming back to the question of this machine replacing musicians, back in mid-80s, we had a little hiccup when we were told that the Musicians' Union in Australia had banned the Fairlight from the studio, and that no union member would play in a studio that had a Fairlight. And so I rang up the Musicians' Union and I said, I'm interested in joining the union, can you send me out a form? And so I got this form and I photocopied it a few times, and then I said, my name, Fairlight number 27, address 15 Boundary Street, Rushcutters Bay, here's my fee. That machine's now a member of the union. And I can't imagine what happened to these. I would think it went into someone's too-hard basket pretty quickly, and the whole subject was dropped very quickly. But I don't really think... I think this sort of technology created a lot more musicians than it took away.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And I mean, when I finally got to work with real orchestras, you know, I was very conscious of the fact that I never would have got to do that had I not learned to do it, you know, via the Fairlight. Didn't go to Juilliard, you know, didn't train formally, was never a first violinist that turned conductor, turned composer. There's no other way, you know, there's no way I would have ended up working with an orchestra if it hadn't been for this machine. Well,
why don't we end part one by having a listen to some of the machine? You want to show us something, Thomas?
I can try.
Yeah, you want to just explain about this? This is a little bit of a historic sound. This instrument is a remake of the original Fairlight using modern technology, and the reason that I did it was that over the last few years I was receiving emails on a weekly basis from someone in Brazil or someone in Holland who's had a Fairlight and they've kept it alive for 30 years, but now their 8-inch floppy disk's worn out, or they can't get a new picture tube for the monitor, or things like that, and they were truly distraught. There were people who were like they'd lost a member of the family, and they're saying, "Please, can you help me?" And I emailed some of them back, and I said, "What's wrong with you? Why are you still using this?" It's 2010, 2009 it was, and you know, for $50 you can get a piece of software on your Mac that will outperform this greatly. And I got these outpourings. I've got these letters where people are bearing their soul and telling me how I just don't understand how important this instrument was to them. And I had a similar experience when I took this prototype to the NAMM show last year, which is the big music traders show in Los Angeles. And we had it on exhibit there. And more than one person came up to it and just, they weren't expecting to see it there. And they said, "Oh my God, it's a Fairlight." And there'd be a tear running down their cheek. And these were like, you know, musicians in their 50s and 60s, and they would tell me these incredible stories about how they first came to use the Fairlight and the people involved, and how they wrangled to buy one or to use one, and you know, someone who deliberately failed his university course in music 3 times just so that he could stay at the university and keep using the Fairlight. So I thought there's obviously a demand there for something that's very different, and as Thomas was talking about earlier, the limitations of the instrument are part of its appeal, because not only do you have to create music that doesn't have 300 channels and 50 gigabytes of samples and so on. You have to be quite deliberate and clever about how you use it. But the other thing was this sequencer that Thomas mentioned, what we call page R, which the R stood for rhythm, because initially it started off as just something that was like a rhythm generator, but then it turned into a whole composition tool. And that was born out of something that I'd come up with, which was called MCL, Music Composition Language. And that was sort of the nerds version of what the musicians ended up having. And it was actually a programming language where you would say, play an A for 1.5 beats and then play a C for 2 beats, and then repeat all this 4 times, and while you're doing that, play this at the same time. So you ended up with just a tiny bit of text, which was incomprehensible to any normal human being, but would actually play complicated pieces of music. And then one of our employees, Michael Carlos, took that concept and said, let's put it on a screen so that you can see what you can move things around and it makes sense to musicians. So that's how the 30th anniversary edition of the Fairlight came into existence, and that I thought we'd have something that has that sort of retro charm, but is made with modern day technology that can be repaired when it breaks, and also at a fraction of the price. So instead of a $200,000 instrument, it's a $20,000 instrument, which is still a lot of money, but there's fortunately it's turned out that there's a lot of people around the world who've decided, am I going to buy a motorbike or am I going to buy a Fairlight? It's sort of a midlife crisis thing for the for people who used to have the Kate Bush pictures on their bedroom wall. And the sounds that we've got on this tonight are from the original Fairlight library that we used to ship with the machines. And what you'll hear is piano and strings, which by modern standards are pretty rough and ready. But you have to imagine being a musician in 1982 who's never heard anything except when you played an electronic keyboard, it would sound like an organ, or it would sound electronic, like electronic Fender Rhodes or something like that. And when they stood there and they played this very sound which we're about to hear, their jaws would drop and they'd look underneath it to see, where's the little man playing a piano, and it was just incomprehensible. I mean, nowadays everyone knows you can do that, but you have to imagine the first time that was ever possible, let alone taking a sound of, my favourite one was you just turn on the microphone and you'd go ding like that, and then play back this sort of cacophony of massive bells and things. It was pretty impressive. So we'll hear one of Thomas's contemporary pieces on original Fairlight sounds.
All right. Thank you. Do you need to...
Just set this up. All right, should be good to go.
Okay. Thank you. So I do actually remember the first time I ever played this Fairlight piano, and this was my piano on tour for about a 6-month tour in 1983, I think. And it was a damn sight easier than, you know, trying to carry a grand piano around on tour with you, and marginally more in tune, I think. But I didn't want to do anything sort of up tempo tonight because I'm going to be here tomorrow, folks, and I'm going to play a bunch of old and new stuff, but I didn't want to like play a pop hit or anything. So I thought I'd play a ballad, and maybe with my jet-lagged voice I could get away with it. So this is a song called "Love Is a Loaded Pistol," and I'd like to dedicate it to Amy and Etta and Whitney. Crept softly into my waking arms, warm like a sip of sour mash, strange fruit for a sweet hunk of trash. Panic at the stage door of Carnegie Hall. Famous jazz singer gone AWOL. Must have left the building, body and soul. On a creaky piano stool tonight, with the moon as my only witness. She was breathing in my ear. This time it's love. But love is a loaded pistol. By daybreak she's gone over the frozen river home. Me and Johnny Walker see in the new age alone. Stormy weather, cross the moon tonight. Billy, time is a wily trickster, still an echo in my heart says, this time it's love.
We're about to get into part two, but I don't think I actually said who I am at the beginning, so that's very remiss of me. My name's Tim Ritchie, and I now work for Radio National. But at this time that we're talking about, I worked for Double into Triple J. What I'd like to talk about first, Peter, is the app. So there was a tool that people paid $100,000 for, and now on an iPhone you can get an app for $50 that does the same thing.
Yeah, well, it's not quite the same thing, but it's certainly a lot of it. And it was originally conceived as sort of a promotional tool, like a little gimmick, and we were discussing should we make a giveaway app that that we can just get the word out there to promote Fairlight. And it ended up being so much better than that, because Thomas Bishop, who developed it for us, who used to work for me 30 years ago and who's now a software engineer, did such a great job of it that we thought, hey, this is almost like a Fairlight in your pocket. This is much more than just a toy. And in January, about 12 months ago, I was visiting some people at Apple headquarters in the United States who are Fairlight enthusiasts, and invited me up there to talk about all things Fairlight. And I showed them the app, and they just about wet themselves, and because it was Apple and it was Fairlight, all in the one thing. And they said, how much are you going to sell it for? And I said, well, what's the most expensive app of this sort of thing that's in the App Store at the moment? And they said, oh, maybe $12 or $15. And I said, well, 50 sounds about right. And so that's what we ended up doing, is that we pitched it at $50, which is 0.1% of the price of the very first Fairlight we sold, at $50,000. That was typical of my business acumen. It was costing us $50,000 and we sold it for $50,000. But that's another story. And so we put this app on the market, hit the App Store at $50. And initially, we got some scathing reviews. There was like two or three of those online app reviewer type people. He said, this is just rubbish. I've wasted $50. I want my money back. For $5, I can get GarageBand. It's 10 times better than this. And so for the first couple of weeks, there were 3 or 4 people who just raged about what a rip-off it was, and I felt cheated, and it was as if someone had stolen their family jewels. And I emailed them back and I said, I'm sorry you're disappointed with this, but it does say in the description that this is a recreation of how it was in the 1980s. And I think I describe it as part adventure game and part musical app, because it's totally the opposite of everything Apple. Like Apple, normal iPhone apps, you just pick them up and there's colour things and you touch them and you slide them around and it all, a 3-year-old can work it immediately. And this is just black with green text on it, and you've got to type lots of numbers in. You have to have really good eyesight. You can actually produce whole compositions and songs using the original Fairlight sounds, but you have to have very small fingers, very good eyesight, and a lot of patience. And so these people who were bitching about it, I just said, I'm sorry you're disappointed, but the description does say that. And they just said, I never read that crap. So and Apple doesn't refund you money. I mean, the money when you buy an app doesn't go to the developer, it goes to Apple, and then Apple pays part of it back to the developer. And Apple won't give you your money back just because you don't like the app. So they were complaining about that too. And so I just said, have you got a PayPal account? Give me a PayPal number and I'll give you the money back personally. And so I refunded 1 or 2 people their $50, and that was the last I heard of it. And since then, I think we've sold about 7,000 copies over the last year. And again, I get these emails from people pretty much sort of on average about once a week. I'll say, you don't know who I am, but I'm a 50-year-old man living in Brussels, and having this app has brought me so much joy, because when I was a kid, I used to have posters of Peter Gabriel and Kate Bush on my wall, and now I can spend endless hours pretending that I'm a pop star of the 80s playing with my app. So go figure, but it means a lot to these people.
So after you had developed Fairlight, you then left Fairlight. Why did you want to leave Fairlight?
Well, I was at it for 14 years. That was a pretty full-on 14 years. Like, it was 24/7, and a lot of it sort of most of the time away from Australia, delivering these things and demonstrating them at trade shows and that sort of thing. And it was always a financial struggle right from the start. It was a way too expensive product. It was only affordable by elite musicians, and therefore, when we were selling instruments that were like $100,000 plus before very long, and that meant that if we lost one sale, we couldn't pay the wages that month. So it was just a financial nightmare from the beginning. From the day that Kim and I went to the bank and said, we're going to build this computerised music synthesizer and we need to borrow $5,000 and that's all we're ever going to need because that's a lot of money. And we explained it all to the bank manager, who sort of sat there with this glazed expression, and when we'd finished he said, I don't know much about computers, I don't know much about music, but I do know there's money in computers. So here's your $5,000, and we got that loan. And that was just, that just was the tip of the financial iceberg, and that as the thing became more successful, we needed more capital. And it was, in those days, very difficult to get capital anywhere, let alone in Australia, particularly in Australia. This was pre-Silicon Valley VC time. This was exactly the same time that Bill Gates was developing starting to develop Microsoft software and so on. And it was a very, very difficult project. That was by far the hardest part of the project, was paying the wages every week. And after 14 years, we were about to list the company and raise some money on the ASX, and again with immaculate timing, the stock exchange crash of 1989 sort of put an end to that. And I said, oh, bugger it, I'll go and build a house. And so I spent the next 4 years building a house, which was a whole different experience.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.